Last time we were talking about some of the basic questions of metaphysics, the question of what there is. And we saw both in classical Indian philosophy and also in ancient Greek philosophy the attempt to answer that question by coming up with a theory of categories, the basic kinds of things that are, you might say, the basic ways of being. And if you say the kinds of being, that sounds really scary. But if you simply say, look, the basic kinds of things that have being, that are in some sense, then you can make sense of what those Indian philosophers and what Aristotle was doing. Today I want to look at a more specific question because we identified in both traditions the idea that there are different categories of things, different kinds of things that exist, but that the most fundamental is substance. That's something on which the Vaisheshika philosophers in India and Aristotle agree. But now, what is a substance? Well, intuitively, you could say a substance is just a thing. It's just an object. But what is it to be an object? What is it to be a thing? What is it to be a substance? We've seen some criteria in Aristotle. For example, a substance is something that can have contrary qualities. And so we're going to investigate that further today, because Aristotle thinks that if we do, we're led to a really important conclusion about the nature of substances. So let's think about that problem of contrary qualities. It is fundamental for him that a substance can admit contrary qualities. Contrary meaning that nothing can have them at the same time. So it's like being black all over and white all over, for example. Nothing can be those things at the same time. Or it could be being, well, hot and not hot, being tall and not tall. These are contrary qualities. Something can't have both at the same time. Now, what about different times? Intuitively, we want to say, and Aristotle thinks this is fundamental, a thing, of course, can't have those contrary qualities at the same time. That's what makes them, by definition, contrary. But it can have them at different times. So I might be small as a youngster, but I might be tall as an adult. I might not be able to speak when I'm young, but I might be able to speak when I'm older. I might be sitting, then I might be standing. I might be asleep, then I'm awake, and so on. All of those things can be contrary qualities that I have at different times. But it's still me. Now that raises a question. How is it possible? If something can't have these contrary qualities at one time, how is it possible for the same thing to have these contrary qualities at different times? How is that possible? It doesn't seem, in a certain sense, like a deep question. How can it be that you're right now sitting, but were standing just a few moments ago? That you're now stationary, but were moving? You think, well, things change, right? I changed. I was standing, then I sat down. I was moving, walking to class, now I sat down, and I'm stationary. And so all of that might seem unproblematic. But in Greek philosophy, it didn't emerge as unproblematic at all. In fact, it seemed like a deep puzzle. The problem really is the problem of change. We want to say something has some quality, some property, F, at one time, but then later it lacks that property. It has the property of not being F. And so those are clearly contrary. It's in fact contradictory properties, F and not F. For example, you might be moving and then not moving. You might be asleep and then not asleep. Or, if this lecture keeps going this way, maybe by then you will be back asleep again. Here we've got the candle gradually melting, and so it is solid when we first light the candle, but then by the time it's burned down, it is no longer solid. And so the candle, the wax there, has the property of being solid. By the end, it is not solid. So how is that possible? Well, here was Heraclitus, an ancient Greek philosopher, who thought that everything was constantly changing. He's famous for saying you can't put your foot in the same river twice. And we'll come back to that thesis because it's quite an interesting thesis in another context. But he's saying, look, okay, this, you say, was solid, it is not now solid. It says it's not the same wax. Surely the same thing cannot be both solid and not solid. And so it can't be that that same wax had the property of being solid and is now not solid. You're saying the same thing is solid and not solid? No. Now, intuitively, you want to say, wait, I'm saying it was solid. It is now not solid. And we think the verb tense there makes a difference. But Heraclitus simply said solidity and something contrary to solidity, being melted, let's say, being liquid, these are things that you're attributing to the wax. The same thing cannot be both solid and liquid. It cannot be both solid and not solid, so it is not the same wax. every time something changes, it is a new object. So, I think I'm tired of being this old Dan Bonnevac. I want to be a different Dan Bonnevac. Ha! It's a new me. Ha! New again. Oh, I just said something new again. Oh, yeah. See, every time I say something, I'm a new man. Well, that seems preposterous, right? And Aristotle would think it's preposterous. But Heraclitus thinks, no, everything at every moment changes. As we'll see later in the course, this is the position of most Buddhist philosophers. It is also, in some sense, the position of David Hume. So it's not as if there was just one crazy Greek guy who thought this. Actually, this is something that has been a very influential view. The thought is, the same thing can't have contrary qualities, so every time a thing changes, it must be a different thing. Well, that's one way to look at it. Another ancient Greek philosopher, Parmenides, drew exactly the opposite conclusion. He said, wait, you're saying the same thing, the solid and then not solid? I'm sorry, that's impossible. Okay? Can't be that this thing was both solid and not solid. So, conclusion, change is impossible. Now you might think, what do you mean change is impossible? Parmenides would say, well, I just showed you. If something changes, it has a certain property that it then lacks. But you're saying then that the same thing has and lacks that property. Nothing has and lacks the same property. Therefore, change is impossible. And there were other arguments for that conclusion. Zeno's paradox, for example. Zeno's paradox said, look, it's impossible for anything to move. Why? You might think, intuitively, I could walk over there and touch that map of the world. But Zeno says, no, you couldn't. In order to do that, you'd have to first go halfway. And then you'd have to go halfway to the wall again. And then you'd have to go half that distance again, and so on. And you'd never get to the wall. So it's impossible to get to the wall, so nothing can ever move. Now you might think, that's ridiculous, right? I go halfway, then I go halfway again, then I go halfway again, then I go, and am I stuck here forever in this infinite descending sequence of nothing? Okay? And so you might think, so much for Zeno, so much for Parmenides. See, it's possible to move, things change, QED. Well, not so simple, right? Heraclitus would say every single time you moved there, you were a different person. But Parmenides says things only appear to move. I grant that it looked like Bonnevac walked across there and touched the map, but it's impossible. Because it implies he's both here and there. But nothing can be both here and there. Therefore, didn't happen. You say, but I saw it. Well, who are you going to believe? Parmenides or your lying eyes? Now, what do we want to say about this? The form of argument that both Parmenides and Heraclitus are taking seriously is the one I've tried to sketch here. For this to make sense, we've got something, for example, the wax, having a certain property, F, like being solid, at a certain time, and then later not having that property, right? So the same thing, A, is supposed to have the property F at time t1, let's say, and not have that property at time t2. That's what change is. But wait a minute, nothing can be both F and not F, and so those premises cannot be true together. It can't be that the same A has that property at one time and does not have that property at another time. That leaves us with two options. Either that change didn't happen, one of those is merely an illusion, that's Parmenides' view, or it's a different thing, it's not the same A. Because surely A can't be both F and not F, it can't be both solid and not solid, it can't be both moving and stationary, asleep and awake, etc., etc. And so, those premises just can't be true together. So, either change is impossible, it's merely an illusion, or we've got different things at different times, as Heraclitus thinks. By the way, I don't know how to tell the story that change is impossible, really, because if I say change is illusory, you might say, well, wait, I'm now undergoing this illusion of change. See, I'm seeing his hand is moving, but I wasn't undergoing that illusion a moment ago, so that means I'm changed, right? I used to not have that illusion, and now I have that illusion. And how do you answer that? I guess Parmenides would have to say, no, you don't. It's an illusion that you think you have that illusion. I don't know. Anyway, it's sort of hard, it seems to me, to be a Parmenidean all the way across the board. But, in fact, I like putting it this way. Did Parmenides ever change anybody's mind? If not, what's the point? If he did, his theory is refuted. So, anyway. Yeah, I studied. During the presidential campaign last year, I started putting it, Donald Trump has this certain style of tweeting things out, and I started tweeting philosophical arguments out under the name Donald J. Trump. You can actually, there was a website you can go, fake Trump tweets, and you can make these tweets. So I had the presidential candidate at the time, tweeting out all these things that I was putting on Facebook, and one of them was about Parmenides. Did Parmenides ever change anybody's mind? If he did, ... and only philosophers would really get the joke. And yeah, several philosopher friends told me to cut it out. But it was actually pretty humorous. And I almost assigned people the task in my intro philosophy class of doing that. Why? Because to actually put a philosophical argument in a tweet, 140 characters or less, it's actually really challenging. And it's also a way of thinking, do I really understand this? Here's the challenge. Can you put this philosophical point or argument in 140 characters or less? It's like tough. And the way I always did it, I had fewer than 140 because I had to say, sad or pathetic or something like that at the end. So anyway. Okay, so how can we account for change? That's the argument that both Heraclitus and Parmenides are driven by. They're thinking, wait a minute, this thing can't have this property and not have this property, so either it's not the same thing or the change is an illusion. It's not really true that it has and lacks the same property. Well, how do we account for change? What happens here? How can it be the same thing and yet change some property? Here we see an old-fashioned candle factory. And you might think, look, here's what's going on. A substance is something that actually can undergo change and can nevertheless be the same thing. That's, in a sense, the definition of substance in Aristotle. And he's setting it up this way for a reason. He's saying, look, it's obvious that certain things can persist and yet change. That you can be the same person who sleeps and then wakes up, who moves and then sits down and stays still, and so on. And how is that possible? Aha, there must be something that makes you you. And it doesn't depend on whether you're asleep or awake. It doesn't depend on whether you're standing or sitting. It doesn't depend on whether you're speaking or silent. It doesn't depend on any of that. And similarly, that can be the same wax, even though at one time it's solid, at another time it's liquid. So is that possible? There must be something, some subset of the properties of the thing, you might think, that actually make it be the same thing. Other properties can change, but some properties stay the same and make it the same thing. So Aristotle says there is such a thing as an essence of a thing. You have an essence. There are properties that are essential to you. If we mess with those properties, you'd be a different person. But other kinds of properties we can change, and you can remain the same. So, here's the idea. An essential property is one which really is part of the core of the thing. It gives it its identity. Without it, the thing wouldn't be what it is. But other properties are accidental. Okay? An essential property, you might say, is necessary to the thing. The thing has these properties by virtue of what it is. So an essential property is something that is really constitutive of the identity of the thing. It helps to make it what it is. It's necessary to its being that thing. Now, what is an essential property? That's kind of a tricky question. Okay, we're going to have to think. For example, with respect to wax. What is essential to being wax? And immediately you can think, well, there are two parts of this. What is essential to being wax? And also, what is essential to being this wax? This candle, let's say. Similarly, I can ask, what's essential to being a human being? But also, what's essential to being me? What's essential to being this human being? And so we can think about essences of kinds, essences of what Aristotle would call secondary substances, but also essences of primary substances, individual objects. We can ask about the essence of a table. What is it to be a table? But also the essence of this table. What is it that makes this table this very table? Now, the opposite of an essential property is an accidental property. And they're much easier to think about. These are the properties which the thing can lose or have without changing its nature. It can remain the same even without this property. Okay? These are contingent. The thing might have them, might not have them. It doesn't have to have them to be what it is. So, for example, the candle. You might think, yeah, that wax is something that doesn't have to have solidity to be that wax. It can melt and become liquid, and it's still that wax. You don't have to be awake to be you. You could be asleep and you would still be you. You don't have to be sitting in order to be you. You could stand up. You could lie down. It would still be you. Those properties are accidental to you. So let's think about some of these. There's a picture of me teaching from last semester. An action shot. Now, what are some of my accidental properties? Properties that I have, let's say, but that I could lose, and that would still be me. Yeah. My what?
Your clothing?
My clothing, yes. Yes, I could take off my clothes. I could wear different clothes. I would still be me, right? I mean, I won't do it. I mean, it would be not only inappropriate, but I would humiliate all the guys, you know. but I mean, underneath it, I'm really, you know, built like Arnold. I mean, Arnold like 1976, not Arnold 2017. Anyway, yeah, my clothing is inessential to me. I might dress this way, I might dress another way, it's still me. What are some other things that are accidental to me? Yeah?
The action of me teaching.
The action of me teaching, exactly. Right now, I'm teaching a class. When I stop teaching, am I no longer myself? No, it's still me, right? When I walk out the door, it's not like suddenly it's a different person. Who was teaching that class? Professor Bonneback, but he doesn't exist anymore. What do you mean? I just walked the hall. No, it's a different guy, so he's not teaching now. It's still me, right? Teaching is an accidental property of mine. What are some other accidental properties that I have? Yeah. My glasses, exactly, that's an accidental property. I can take off my glasses, it's still me. It's, yeah. It is still me. I would be somewhat, I would have a harder time reading, I would have a harder time recognizing any of you. But still, it's still me, right?
What if you like lost your hand? You'd still be you, but you wouldn't have your hand. Like, does that count?
Okay, good. Is my hand essential to me? No. If I was in an accident somehow and lost my hand, it would still be me. I would still be Dan Bonneback without a hand. You wouldn't say, oh gosh, got to get a new social security number, different guy now. Right? Yeah.
What if part of your brain was removed? And secondary, what if part of your brain was removed and replaced with the brain of somebody else, and vice versa?
Ooh, all right, you're asking an awesome question. Yeah, what about my brain? What if you took away part of my brain? Would it still be me? Now, that, you know, it might depend what part, right? And this gets into some subtle questions. So in fact, maybe it's time now to shift to this question. What are my essential properties? What really is essential to me? Because you introduce two questions. First of all, what if somebody removed part of my brain? Secondly, what if we swapped brains? What if, let's say, this guy and I were part of some mad scientific experiment? Somebody swapped our brains. They did a brain transplant, put my brain in his body, his brain in my body. Now, who would be who? Philosophers have actually debated this question. And from one point of view, you might say, look, he would wake up suddenly thinking, why am I in this old man's body? Right? He would look in the mirror and say, oh my gosh, you know, I have gray hair, and so on. And I would look in the mirror, or look down and think, I'm young again. This is awesome. Okay? And so that's one way of looking at it. There it might seem as if what was really essential to being me was the brain, or the mental function that went along with having that brain, and not the body. But of course, another philosopher came along and said, well, but why can't we see the story this way? You wake up and you suddenly think, why is this other person's thought process in my head? Like, why am I having all these weird thoughts? Why am I having these strange memories? Anyway, maybe that's the way of thinking about it, and then we'd say the body is essential. Maybe we'd say this is so bizarre we don't know what to say, it's just indeterminate whether we've got the same person. That feels uncomfortable from Aristotle's point of view, but from the point of view of David Hume or Buddhism, or for that matter Heraclitus, that's actually quite a natural way to feel about it. Sometimes our view about what's the same object is very well defined, and they can say sometimes it's just indeterminate. We wouldn't know what to say. But in any case, yeah, that's a really interesting kind of case where we think, essentially, is what's really essential to me something mental, perhaps tied to the activity of my brain, or is it something physical, like having my body? And luckily, since we don't know how to do brain transplants yet, we don't face that as a practical question. But you might imagine that in the not so distant future, that will happen. Somebody suffers a brain injury, for example, and you sort of, just like, you might give somebody a heart transplant or a liver transplant, you give them a brain transplant. Why not? If we get to that stage, then this will raise all sorts of really deep, puzzling questions about identity. Yeah?
What about like gene editing? Because right now that's something that's in the works, and soon it's probable that it will be applied on humans, and I mean like very soon.
All right, good question. You might think, here's what's essential to being me, my DNA, my genetic structure. But what about things like gene editing? What if the doctor does some sophisticated genetic test on me and finds out, wait, you're susceptible to a certain disease? But we can fix that. We can go in and mess with your DNA and get rid of that gene that's causing this. Then, gosh, am I a different person as a result of that? I think intuitively we say, no, it's still me. I'm just less liable to be suffering from that disease. But now what if we go further and say, but wait, while we're in there messing with your genetic structure, we can make you smarter. And we can also make you more, you'll be able to resist the temptation of peanut M&Ms and tortilla chips.
Or like change your eye color.
Ooh, I don't know. but nevertheless, you might think, yeah, wait a minute, once we start messing with things that affect personality, what do we say? Yeah.
Couldn't this definition of your essential self be extended to like sort of a dialectic between how you interpret your own essence of being and how others view your essence of being as well? So like, say you woke up, I would say like you woke up in your brain in someone else's body, you perceive your essence as still being, say I'm Tyler, but I wake up in Fred's body. I'd still say that I'm Tyler in Fred's body, but they'd say I'm Fred with someone else's brain.
Yeah. Okay, good. There are two different perspectives here, right? There's my internal perspective, and there it feels really powerful, I think, to think, no, it's the mental that matters. I'm going to wake up and find myself in a different body. That's the thing that's going to be strange. But on the outside, it's going to look like Fred, in the example, is now just behaving strangely. Suddenly, after having no discernible interest in philosophy his entire life, he's going to wake up and start spouting philosophical maxims. And other people are going to think, what's going on here? And so, yeah, there is that problem. We've got both the external problem of identifying people and also this internal problem of what makes me me. Some philosophers are going to say they're not that different. It's just that I see more data inside myself than you do. Others are going to say, of course, they're radically different. That internal perspective, I am privy not just to this thought, that feeling, but to be me. And that's really something unobservable by anybody else. So from certain points of view, those will look like radically different problems. Yeah?
In this sort of hypothetical where we're switching brains with people, could it not be said that both are essential properties? Because if I switch brains with someone that is terribly unhealthy, might their ailments affect my brain? And might my brain also affect their ailments? Like if I have an anxiety disorder or something like that, might that make me die earlier because I have higher blood pressure or something like that?
Right. All right, that's a really interesting question. Thinking about the way in which the brain and body interact is complicated. We now know, for example, that it's not very easy to divide things into nature and nurture, what is environmental and what is genetic. Environment shapes genetics in all sorts of complicated ways. And there's a similar kind of thing with the structure of the brain and the nature of the body. And so to think, it's just as simple as transplant brain, now what happens? It may be that now what happens is this complicated interaction of things, which produces somebody who has some of the characteristics of each person going into this. And so you're right. I mean, it only seems to have a simple and clearly delineated character as a thought experiment. As soon as you think, wait, what would it actually be like to put a different brain in a body? It's going to be complicated and weird. Have any of you seen The Man with Two Brains, Steve Martin movie?
Yeah.
Oh, well, if you haven't seen it, you're deeply culturally deprived and philosophically unprepared. But anyway, it's all about this sort of brain transplant and this woman he falls in love with, Anna Amamahe, who is just a brain. And he goes around trying to find a body to put this brain in so that he can actually marry Anna Amomahe. And, well, then all sorts of ridiculous things ensue. I won't ruin the movie for you. But in a way, once the brain transplant happens, yes, there are interactions. I won't go further. Anyway, what are some other possible essential properties of me? Maybe it has something to do with my brain. Maybe it has something to do with my mental life. What could we say about that? Yeah.
I think it's your memories.
Oh, what about my memories? Could you replace my memories, or could I have amnesia and lose all my memories and still be me? Suppose I actually did suffer amnesia, and let's suppose those memories are irretrievably gone. Am I still me?
You still have a concept of self. You know, you don't have a name attached to it or memories attached to it, but you still see, perceive, think. You have consciousness.
That's right. I still have consciousness, and in some sense there's still a me there. But if you say, oh, you're still you, who are you? I don't know. Yeah.
Well, with that, would your essential properties be changed if you lose all your memories?
Well, in a way, that's the question. Would my essential properties be changed? And I think it's a hard question. I'm not saying, oh, yes, memories. I don't know how to think about that problem. And in a sense, we have to think, yeah, is somebody who really loses all their memories still not the same person? If you think memory is part of what gives you a continuity of consciousness, and we're going to look very soon at a philosopher who thinks that, then amnesia is the kind of thing that really could disrupt your identity. Yeah?
So, like, with what you're explaining, would someone's fears, like, even if they lost their memory, like, would their fears still be able to kind of define them as...
Okay, good. What about their fears? What about their desires? What about all sorts of other mental tendencies that people have that we would say constitutes their personality? That would allow us to say maybe memory is only one component of that. Maybe it's not an essential component, but there's something that defines that person's personality. And in fact, there, the removal of part of the brain becomes a key issue. Actually, I have a daughter, a UT grad, who was engaged to someone who then had brain surgery, and really did seem like that person became a different person after the surgery. Quite a different personality. And in that kind of case, you would think, well, wait, is this the same person? In fact, sometimes my daughter has said, I think my fiance died on the operating table that day, and it's now just a different person in that body. The relationship did not last, as you might imagine. But yeah, that's something that is a dramatic case of, wait a minute, it feels like it's not just the memories. Actually, the memories weren't so different. It was just personality in a broader sense. What that person liked and disliked, what they were like in general just changed. Yeah.
Can essential properties be on like a degree scale as well? Like you are more or less that person at any given time?
Oh, really good question. Can you be more or less that person? Remember, Aristotle thought substance wasn't a matter of degree. But these kinds of things might make you wonder, is he right about that? You might say, well, gosh, is that Dan Bonavac? I don't know. He seems a little more Dan Bonavac than he was yesterday. Right? A few of those aspects of personality seem to be coming back. And I think we can make sense of that. So yeah, I think it may be a sort of slippery borderline here. Maybe there are cases where we say, clearly a different person, clearly the same person, and in between there might be some fuzzy cases where there's a lot of personality change, but it's not total, and we start thinking, I don't know what to say. Yeah.
Like your being a professor would be considered an accidental property,
Right.
but your being a professor has a domino effect on you as your personality. So in that sense, would accidental properties, how would you define the line between accidental properties and essential properties? Because you being a teacher makes you the Dan Bonavac, you know?
All right, that's a great question. We agreed earlier that my being a teacher is something that is an accidental property of mine. However, you might think, wait, your personality develops in the way that it does, partly because of this. My grandfather would have liked it if I had taken over his plumbing business. So suppose that I had become a plumber instead. Would I have the personality traits I have now as a professor? Probably some of them, but probably quite a few would be different, because the virtues you need as a plumber are different from the virtues you need as a philosophy professor. And you might say in those cases, what would we say about that? Would I be the same person or a different person? Well, in one sense, obviously the same person. but with a personality that would in some ways be different, right? Because the personality you develop over time and the occupation you fulfill, the relationships you're in with other people, all of those things affect one another. Yeah?
Does being you kind of have to do with your own choices? Because like in the dialogue ion, like you get kind of possessed, does that still make you a different person? But like even if it's just like an accidental property because you're not like choosing it, it's just kind of happening to you and you're kind of like in a trance, or the things that kind of happen to you like in a subconscious level necessarily, do those affect like your properties? Because you like chose to be a philosophy professor and you choose to wear glasses even though you may physically need them, you choose not to wear them. So how does this like idea of free will play into your properties?
Okay, that's a great question. How does free will enter into this? And what do we say when people suffer strong passions? In fact, passion is related to passing. The idea is a passion is something that happens to you. So let's say you fall in love, desperately in love. Are you the same person? You might start behaving quite differently from the way you were behaving before you fell in love. And to some extent, it might be a voluntary act that you fall in love. But yes, the same sort of thing with even something as minor as wearing glasses. I had a close friend in college who was badly nearsighted but wouldn't wear glasses. He just read everything close up. And I said, but look, that means as you're walking around campus, you don't really recognize people. And he said, yeah, it's true, but I kind of feel like I'm getting a greater sense of their aura by not seeing the details, by seeing the general shape of the person, their general form of movement. And I can recognize people pretty well by doing that. That was a choice, but it did have it's not only a reflection of something about his personality, it's also something that helped to shape his personality. And so once you start bringing personality into this, you're right, you get all sorts of complicated questions. Fall in love, are you the same person? Decide you're not going to wear your glasses anymore, are you the same person? And so on. It may actually change your personality in some ways. And we don't want to say every change of personality makes you a different person. But in cases where there's a radical change, there's a guy famous from the history of psychology, for example, who was working on the railroad and got a steel rod into his brain, and it hugely affected his personality. Suddenly he began cursing like a sailor all the time, and not caring about other people and so on. And that kind of radical brain injury is something that we often think, yeah, this is a different person. There's hardly any personal characteristics this person used to have that still have. Yeah? Ooh, when we think about gender and ethnicity and things like that, those two are components of identity. And so we can start thinking, wait a minute, what do we say about cases like that? I had a good friend in high school who was male then, but has transitioned and is now female. What do you say about a case like that? That seems like a pretty radical change in identity. Same person, different person. A lot of aspects of the personality just the same, but some salient ones not the same. So anyway, if once we bring personality in, we start thinking, wait, this is complicated now. It's very tricky. Let's take it out of the human realm and see if it's easier. What makes this chair? What are essential properties of being this chair? Now remember, we had said, being a chair, that's hard to say what the essential properties are. But how about being this chair? Now somebody's proposed being black. If I were to paint this chair, would it still be this chair or a different chair? It'd be the same chair, right? I mean, I had chairs at the cottage in New Hampshire that used to be yellow and then got painted rust color and then got painted blue and then got painted white and finally got thrown away. But it was the same chairs all throughout. Yeah.
What's the name of that analogy? The boat where they were placed at plank by plank? Yeah.
Yes, the ship of Theseus.
Yeah.
We'll be talking about that later. You start replacing planks on the boat. And eventually you've replaced every single plank. Is it the same boat? Anyway, we're going to talk much more about some of these deeper questions of identity. But I think what this points out is that even though chairs and boats don't have personalities, you get a similar problem of how much you can change it and still have it be the same chair or the same boat. Yeah?
Does that not happen? Maybe some biology major. Does that not happen with your atoms as well?
It used to be said that every 7 years, every particle of your body is now a different physical particle. Now people doubt this. But anyway, you might think, wait long enough and they'll be different. Now, we've been taking lots of time about this, so let me go from these examples to think of the details of the way Aristotle thinks about it. He does not tell us exactly what the essence of a chair is, for example, though he does talk about the essence of being a human being. But he does characterize essence in several different ways. So let's look at those ways. The essence of something is first what it is to be that thing. The essence of X is what it is to be X. So the essence of me is what it is to be me. The essence of a human being, speaking in terms of kinds, is what it is to be a human being. Well, we could also say it's what that thing is by virtue of itself. My essence is what I am by virtue of myself. Not depending on some other thing, what I am really intrinsically, okay? And similarly, a human being, the essence of a human being is what a human being is, purely by virtue of itself. It's also what the thing is by its very nature. So my essence is what I am by my very nature. My essential properties are properties I have, well, by virtue of myself, by virtue of my very nature. And finally, it is what is expressed in a definition of a thing. The definition of the thing is a formula for the nature of X. It is something that states the essence. So if I've got something that is actually a definition, it's something that states the essence of the thing. For example, Aristotle would say that a human being is to be defined as a rational animal. And that tells us that what is essential to us is both rationality and being an animal, if he's right about that. So my essential properties would at least be being rational and being an animal, and then of course I'd have to say, well, and then whatever else it takes for me to be this particular human being. Now what does it mean to talk about the definition? If we're talking about a kind of thing, it seems like, yeah, I know how to define certain general terms. Others like chair and maybe human being I don't, but some I may know how to define. However, how do I know how to define myself? What would it be like to have a definition of you? And in general, how could we think about what is really essential to use? Yeah?
Does that mean that it can be subjective? Because every person, like, I would have a different definition for you than maybe your wife would.
Oh, well, we all have different concepts of one another, right? And so you might think concepts, which are subjective, and the essence of a thing should go together. The concept should reflect the essence of the thing. But now, wait a minute, people can have different concepts, even of what it is to be a human being, but certainly of different people, right? Your concept of me is presumably not the same as my wife's concept of me. That's not the same as my brother's concept of me, not the same as my father's concept of me, etc. And so, what do we say about that? It looks like, is the essence of a thing subjective? Aristotle certainly doesn't want it to be. The concepts might be different, but these properties that I have by my very nature should be uniform. They're part of me. They're intrinsic to me. They don't depend on your concept of me. However, that might make you worry. How do I get at them if not through a concept? My concept of chair should correspond in some way to the essence of chairhood, of what it is to be a chair. But do we know even how to do that with one another? It may be puzzling. Here is something that I've introduced to try to shed some light on this question of what it would be like to define an individual and what it would be to think about their essential properties. Sorry. It's maximum. We can. Not everything but the voices. Oh. Well, there's no point now. Oh no. It's my problem. We're doomed. Oh, what do I do? What do I do? Remember your training. Remember your training. There's a manual. Yeah, the manual. It's as thick as a phone book. Oh, who would think the manual to a nuclear reactor would be so complicated? Now, Homer, pay attention, Homer. In the case of a nuclear meltdown, press this button and only this button. Homer, pay attention. Yeah, press the button. Got it. This is all your fault. Press the button. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. 15 seconds before meltdown. All systems have returned to normal. Section 7. Okay, so now that I look at that, that doesn't seem to actually have anything to do with what we're discussing. But, I mean, it had Homer in the dictionary. And, well, how would really the question was this: how do you define Homer Simpson? I don't know. Stupid. Lucky, and later in the episode people start talking about pulling a Homer, which means to exhibit great luck without any corresponding skill. You see a basketball player fall down in the court and somehow nevertheless get a basket. And he says, I pulled a Homer. Well, okay, now, let's get back to the question of what a substance is. How do we decide what is the essence of a person, of Homer Simpson, of a chair, of a university, an institution of some kind, etc. There are different ways of approaching this. Aristotle says you might think in terms of matter, and maybe sometimes that's the right answer. What is it to be this particular electron? Maybe there's nothing to say except to point at it and say, well, it's being this bit of matter. What about form? Often we point to form. Certainly with kinds we think about form. What is essential to being a tiger? What are tigers by their very nature? You might think that's a matter of the form. The general form of tigerhood that is instantiated in individual tigers, presumably in some kind of biological form. It might be some combination. What is it, after all, to be this electron? You might think, well, there's something that's essential to being an electron, and then this one, it's a question of that form in that matter. And indeed, Aquinas thinks that's what it is to be this human being, to have the form of a human being in this flesh and bone. And so that would be one way of thinking about what it is to be me. What's added to the general form, or the general definition of being a human being, he would say, is just being in this matter. There's nothing else to that. It could be that we think the substance really is to be identified with this essence. Whatever that essence is, you might think, that is not only what it is to be me, that is me. That's the thing that is constant through all this. We want to say, yes, I change, but Dan Bonavac is the substance undergoing those changes, and we've said I have the same essence throughout. The essence remains constant. So you might say, well, you've said Dan Bonavac remains constant, you've said the essence remains constant. Maybe I am just identical with my essence. We do want to say, however, that the same river can flow, that I can put my foot in the same river twice, even though the water is constantly changing. The water is not essential to the river. And yet, what is essential to the river? The Colorado River, for example, tends to have different water in it all the time. And yet it remains the Colorado River. Why? How is that possible? It's not the same matter that's there. It's not exactly the same form, because after all, the river changes. It suddenly swells and has a large amount of water in it, then it dries up. It's something that carries some mud downstream, and so it's constantly changing its shape. Is it the combination, but if neither the matter nor the form are the same, how could the combination be the same? Well, there must be some essence to being the Colorado River, but it looks independent of all those other things. And so there's something deeply puzzling about this. I only took one incomplete my entire time in graduate school. And it was when I was devoting myself to writing a term paper on Zeta, book Zeta, the metaphysics of Aristotle, where I was going to explain how he reconciled all these ways of talking about it as matter, as form, as independent essence, as combination, etc. And eventually I gave up. I spent an entire semester in summer on it and surrendered. Now, we might approach this in a different way. And I want to say something at the end here about the way Aquinas thinks about essences, because it helps to set up the way this is discussed in modern philosophy. He thinks of essences as causes. The essence of me is what causes me to be what I am. And so he distinguishes two senses of essence. One is what he refers to as quiddity. That's not really a good English word, it's just an anglicizing of the Latin word quidditas, which just means whatness. It really is just what the thing is. It is the definition, but in the thing. So for example, if being a human being is being a rational animal, then it is my rational animality that is my quiddity. But now the nature of me is what really is the underlying cause of that. What makes me a rational animal? What is it that makes me what I am? That causes it? It's that by virtue of which I am what I am. So what Aquinas is seeing here is that Aristotle's definitions actually go in different directions. Thinking about what causes me to be what I am, and thinking about simply what would be fulfilling my definition. Those are two different things, or at least they could be two different things. They're two different concepts, at any rate, even if they agree in a particular object. Well, he also thinks about four different kinds of causes. There are causes that are formal, relying on an essence or definition. Those that are material. For example, the causes of a house. The formal cause is something like the design of the house, the blueprint. The material cause is the matter from which the house is built. The efficient cause is the chain of events involved in production. It's the builder and all of the workmen who are working on the house. And then finally, the final cause, that's its goal, its purpose, its function, to be a shelter for people. And so we can talk about four different kinds of causes or explanations. That suggests that there are different ways of thinking about essences. We might have in mind for a particular thing, the essence of a chair, for example, might be a question in part of what it's for. It's for sitting. It might have to do with its shape or its form. It might have to do with a certain kind of matter, and so on. But now here's the thing. The quiddity corresponds to the definition. The nature is what makes it what it is. It's the underlying cause. So think about wax. The quiddity of wax is just what corresponds to the definition of wax. But the nature of wax is what makes it what it is. And you might think, oh, those actually look like different things. For example, the quiddity. That's being a malleable compound at normal temperatures. But the nature of wax is something that is given by organic chemistry. And those look like different things. Next time we're going to look at this as modern philosophers see it, building on Aquinas' insights.